Welcome to the Discuss Podcast, a podcast dedicated to us idiots discussing broad philosophical topics in a more simplistic way for the consumption by the average media consumer, you
Yes,
idiots,
which we also are.
which we also
We
are.
have absolutely no idea what we're talking about.
No disclaimers, we have no expertise on these topics necessarily. We're just very passionate amateurs.
Exactly, and we have some thoughts that we wanted to put down to audio, I
Of
guess.
course, write down for posterity to get our thoughts into the universe.
Exactly. Yeah, it's easy to like have a scattered brain and just think, all these different ideas, but when you actually have to talk about them and put them in,
Yeah, yeah.
you can focus on.
So this is kind of just a coping mechanism for us. This
Yeah.
entire
Yeah.
we're we're avoiding the fear of death, really. Just by
Mm,
assuming we have something left behind.
everything is motivated by death.
Everything is motivated by death, which actually brings us very nicely into our topic for today, which
What are
is
we talking about today, Weston?
we are talking about free will today, Abdullah. We are talking about whether everything you do is caused by something, like a fundamental fear of death, for instance, which is caused by our evolution, etc. We're talking about whether or not you can even have free will and what the implications are of this debate.
Yeah. So I think free will is one of those things that really has extremely wide consequences for how you see the world in general.
Hmm.
It has huge implications for things like moral responsibility, justice, punishment. Like, how do you see the world? If you see the world in a way with no free will, and everybody is just simply being pushed into their position by forces way outside of their control, then it really just changes the way you see everything. How can you possibly blame someone for anything when there's a billion forces acting upon them since the creation of the universe? This like the Big Bang caused them to do this thing. How could you possibly blame them?
Everything simply is the way it is because it also affects relationships on a very personal level. What you can hold someone accountable for, what you can feel justified for emotionally, for holding grudges, or just the way you interact and assume people to be accountable for things.
Absolutely. And on the on the inverse, if you do believe in free will, then people actually, when somebody wrongs you, they have actually, uncaused by anything, somehow wronged you, like cosmically,
Hmm.
you know? And so perhaps like the ideas of sin or transgression, those would be so much more amplified.
Absolutely. You can actually hold them existentially accountable for their
Mhm.
actions, and you have no choice
They're
to.
the sole cause of their
Indeed.
actions.
You can't blame anything about that, unless, of course, you fall somewhere in the middle if you're soft determinism or compatibilism, which we'll discuss soon.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get started with that.
Hmm.
So essentially, there's three main conceptions of free will. Number one, hard determinism,
Hmm.
which would say that there is absolutely no free will. Every single action that you take is predetermined and totally out of your control. Second one would be compatibilism, which surprisingly, actually, most philosophers hold. Over something like 54% of academic philosophers believe in compatibilism, would say that they take a compatibilist view of the world. And the third option would be libertarian free will or libertarianism, not to be confused with political libertarianism, but rather this type of libertarianism says that we have actual control, we have the ability to do otherwise. So that's sort of the difference between compatibilism and libertarian free will. There's two different conceptions of free will. We have the sourcehood conception, which means you're responsible for an action. An action is free the if the cause of that action is you. It's solely you. Whereas the ability to do otherwise conception of free will would be just what it sounds like.
Yeah.
You have two options and you can actually choose otherwise. If you were to rewind the clock, you would actually be able to choose one option over another.
Hmm. Before we continue and explore the definition of free will, I just want to say that is an astounding statistic that 54% of philosophers believe in compatibilism. They're academic philosophers. They don't agree on anything that much.
It's just the one thing that
It's crazy.
somehow so many people agree upon.
So hopefully we'll be able to get into a little bit why compatibilism is so compelling in that
Hmm.
way. But yeah, you're right. We have to start by defining free will. What is free will?
Yeah.
So we've got these two definitions, which, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just going to try and understand and restate what you said. The the could have done otherwise conception, meaning you literally could have picked something else, or sourcehood, where it's considered to be free will if you are the source, you're the sole origin.
And so I actually think that the only way that free will can exist in any sort of meaningful capacity
Mhm.
we would have to have both of these. It would have to have
Really?
both the sourcehood conception and the could have done otherwise. Because if you just have the sourcehood but you couldn't have done otherwise, then how is that really free? We'll get into that more, but
Hmm.
I would say it's not. Where and if you just have the could have done otherwise, but you don't have the cause of the action, then like what does that even mean, right?
Yeah, I don't know what that means. I
Yeah,
was thinking,
you need both. I think feel like.
yeah, wait, is it even possible to have been able to do otherwise and not be the source?
I suppose not, right? Well, it could be like you have the option to do you have two different options and you can choose both options,
Okay.
but something else is causing you to take those,
Okay.
right?
So one of our dear friends believes very deeply in quantum physics.
Yes,
I
exactly.
suppose
Yeah.
if on some level there is a free will that is at least not determined because it's just, random particles appearing and disappearing at true random uh, properties,
Yeah,
that would, I suppose, qualify.
exactly.
But that's not really relevant to this debate, I suppose. I just wanted to pursue that
I think it
tangent.
actually is relevant to
Really?
this debate. Yeah. So, but we'll get into it in a second.
All right.
So, okay, how about we go over the arguments for each for each position?
All right.
Okay. So, number one, hard determinism.
Fullest proponent
Yes.
of hard determinism, which, bias aside, I will try not to argue just for hard determinism. But I genuinely can't see any other way the universe works. I've become so
Yeah.
engrossed within this belief.
Exactly. And yeah, same actually. I would also say that I don't necessarily believe in free will. Uh, but I do think it's very interesting that most philosophers would believe in compatibilism. So I'm probably wrong. Like,
Right.
probably. I just can't really necessarily see the arguments enough to like convince me. But we will go over them. Uh-huh.
I think determinism is pretty hard to combat because the fundamental premise is this: every every action you take has a cause.
Hmm.
And you are not in control of any of these causes, so you're not in any control of these actions.
Absolutely. That chain of causation eventually is going to reach something, is going to terminate. It has to terminate at some point. Eventually it's going to terminate outside of yourself.
Hmm.
We are not the authors of ourselves. That's essentially the argument. So, um,
So, for example, if I just have the option between vanilla ice cream and chocolate ice cream, and there's no other factors in this just random philosophical thought experiment, I might choose chocolate. But why would I choose chocolate? There's always going to be a reason. Whether I'm aware of this reason or not is irrelevant. There's going to be a reason, and maybe it's because I love chocolate the most. And why do I do that? Well, we can actually look. I have these genetic factors. I have these hormonal factors. And I had this experience with chocolate as a child where my mom told me chocolate was the best, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't really matter. The point is, all of those factors that I just listed are beyond my control. And so I am just literally a product of my environment.
yeah, and even in such a simple decision, such as choosing chocolate ice cream over vanilla ice cream, like there's so many factors that go into you wanting that ice cream
Hmm.
that like you can't even comprehend.
No, it's
You know,
insane.
and I think that's just so incredibly fascinating that that if this argument is correct,
Hmm.
all of our actions are being caused by something so far behind us that we can't even comprehend,
Oh, yeah.
right?
So many interactions are going on between so many variables in everything we do, every experience we have. It's really crazy how the simplest of behaviors are actually just a product of literally everything
Mhm.
that factored into it in any way.
Yeah. So essentially, what Weston just described would be a very simple argument. If we were to put into premises, goes like this: if determinism is true, then free will cannot exist. Determinism is true, therefore free will does not exist.
I like that
Yeah,
argument.
that's very simple, right? So now the compatibilist would actually try to say that no, determinism can be true,
Mhm.
and yet we can still have free will. And this conflict is actually not a real conflict. It's not a real contradiction.
Right. They're,
So how? Oh, do you have?
no, yeah, they're compatible. That's the name.
Exactly. Yeah. Um, so compatibilism is very appealing for a number of reasons.
Yes.
Yeah. The main reason why it would be so appealing would be that it allows us to assign moral responsibility to agents.
Hmm.
It allows us to actually say that you've done something that's wrong and it's your fault. It's we can blame you.
And emotionally, that makes a lot of sense with us. That's very resounding with us, especially because that's actually how we've structured our society
Mhm.
today. So if that's false, we have some real problems, morally speaking, that we have. Would you call that a normative argument? Am I using that
Yeah,
correctly?
normative. Yeah, the way that we normatively would structure society
Hmm.
would have to change in such a radical way,
Right.
incredibly radical. Um,
But being me, I have to point out that that kind of a normative argument isn't actually necessarily directly relevant unless it's a case of intuition to
Mhm.
what's actually true.
The truth,
Just
yeah.
because we happen to have structured our society this way doesn't really mean it is that way unless our intuition is somehow related to this argument and it can be trusted,
Yeah.
which I don't think it can be in this particular case.
Yeah. So I think compatibilists, they're essentially going with the sourcehood definition of free will,
Mhm.
not the could have done otherwise, because the compatibilist accepts determinism as true.
Right.
That's the first premise. Determinism is true, and yet free will exists.
Mhm.
So I think what's really the confusion here, and why so many people can't really get their minds around this, is really a compatibilist just has a different definition of free will.
Yeah.
And so I guess you could actually say I'm a compatibilist because I would agree
Mhm.
with. So okay, Arthur Schopenhauer, he had a famous quote which is overused and everything, but he says, "Man can do what he can. The man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills."
Well,
Yeah,
that makes sense.
yeah.
Okay.
But so while Weston and I would look at that and say that's clearly not free will. If you can't will what you will, but you can only do what you will, then how is that free will? The compatibilists would say, no, that actually is free will. That's exactly what we mean by free will.
I intend to be a bit of a cynic, as always. And I just think the compatibilist point of view isn't actually, it is hard determinism, and you've just adapted it slightly, the definitions, so that you can still have society function the way it functions
Yeah,
now. So you
exactly.
can still hold people responsible. So I guess on some level, I am also a compatibilist, but I, I do think it's a very emotionally appealing argument.
So Sam Harris, he has a absolutely fascinating fallacy in his. He brings up this fallacy in his debate with Daniel Dennett, who is probably the most famous compatibilist of all time. And so Daniel Dennett's essentially espousing the compatibilist view, saying that most people actually do believe in free will, and most people would say that his definition of free will is the true definition of free will.
What is
Sa-
his definition?
like the source of definition.
Source it. Just
Yeah,
okay.
just source it. And Sam Harris comes up with this really interesting fallacy that he says Dennett is doing called the Atlantis fallacy.
The Atlantis.
So he says basically, imagine, there's Atlantis. There's like this really cool advanced city that's like underwater
Yeah.
and it like sank, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so now imagine if somebody came up to you and was like, "Hey, I know about a cool city that has like a lot of water and like cool architecture and stuff." And they're like, I think Atlantis is actually just Venice. I think Atlantis and Venice are. I think by Atlantis you're just referring to Venice.
Right.
Yeah, but clearly that's a fallacy,
Oh,
right? We don't care about just the water in Atlantis. We care about the whole, it's sinking into the ocean and like the advanced technology and all that.
right.
And that is really that is essential to the definition of Atlantis.
Man,
You
that
can't just call Venice Atlantis.
mhm. That fallacy, I've never actually heard that before. That makes a lot of sense. I feel like that's applied in a lot of other, especially religious debates.
Yeah.
The Atlantis fallacy. But yeah, I think that makes total sense, and that's my biggest objection to compatibilism.
Mhm.
Is it's really not arguing about free will. It just is a way to sort of satiate these poor free will supporters who can't refute determinism.
Yeah. So compatibilism also has uh so one example of compatibilism, or like a case that's often given for the compatibilist position, is as follows. Imagine that you are going to a voting booth, right? Imagine there's like some guy who's a Democrat,
Right.
right? And no matter what, he's going to vote Democrat,
Okay.
right? And he goes to the voting booth, and unbeknownst to him, the lever or like the button or whatever they use, I don't know, yeah,
The hanging chad.
whatever it is, right? That thing is actually broken for the Republican.
Oh,
So he's actually unable to vote for
the
the Republican
Republican,
candidate,
whether he wants to or not.
whether he wants to or not. There's simply no way for him to do so because the lever's broken.
Right.
Okay, and yet he still, because he is a Democrat,
Hmm.
votes Democrat. The compatibilists would say he's still responsible for his ability for his vote,
Hmm.
even though he couldn't have done otherwise.
Right.
So that would be the source of conception. But now I mean, you want to give the obvious objection to that?
Well, it wasn't really his choice, of course. There was no other outcome.
Hmm. But also, he couldn't have even ever chose to be a Democrat.
No.
There's forces outside of his control that are causing him to become a Democrat.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a little simplistic. We've already assumed free will within this free will
Exactly.
example.
It's sort of begging the question. But sure, if you're going to change the definition of free will to believe in that, then to accommodate that case, then sure,
Mhm.
we can say that's free will. But I just don't personally see that as being free in any real sense.
No, I agree. Now, Daniel Dennett, while we're talking on him, I
Mhm.
was reading, he had an interesting argument, and I might be horribly misinterpreting it, but then I'll present it as my own, I suppose, here, for free will, or at least a sort of agnostic approach to the existence of free will,
Mhm.
which is discriminating between different types of behavior that are influenced by external factors and that are apparently intrinsic behaviors. And obviously, us hard determinists would argue that these seemingly intrinsic behaviors and actions are just simply motivated by factors we don't understand yet. That's the
Mhm.
obvious counter. But things like any complex action, any social actions, science can't really explain those yet. I say yet, possibly ever.
Uh-huh.
We don't know how that works. If I put a tumor in your amygdala, then we can obviously draw a line of causation between how you're no longer afraid of something or, whatever weird behavior that changes. Well, so much of human behavior just seems to come from some other source that we can't yet describe with science.
Yeah.
So I think that is a pretty compelling argument for a, soft determinist approach, at least.
Yeah, some sort of compatibilist view.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's why I think the stronger determinist arguments, let's not even say determinist. I think actually a better word might even be just like fatalist.
Fatalist.
Yeah, the
That
idea
makes
that
sense.
because you're talking about how like quantum mechanics and stuff,
Yeah.
and we actually know now that the world is not deterministic. Determinism is false. Like
Right.
it actually is just false.
Mhm.
Because of quantum fluctuations and wave functions, and particles can actually just randomly choose to be in different states, not choose to be, but like
Right.
it's random.
No,
It's random.
as far as we can tell.
Yeah,
The hard determinist in me it says we need more science before we
that's
can.
true. Like
But I mean, I could make that objection to any claim here, so I'll accept it.
yeah, and that's why I think the strongest argument against free will is actually just to say that free will is impossible. It doesn't matter if determinism or indeterminism is true. It's
Mhm.
simply impossible. It cannot exist.
Right.
And so the argument would essentially go like this. Um, let's say that determinism is true. We already kind of said that clearly,
Yeah.
that doesn't really uh, that doesn't really show that we have free will. Wait, sorry, let me say that again.
Okay. I think
Okay,
I follow, but for the
yeah.
camera, of course.
Okay, so if determinism is true, then it doesn't seem like we can really have any control over our actions in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
Uh, However, if indeterminism is true, if it is the case that we could have done other actions, then it seems like that by definition must simply be probabilistic. If I could
Right.
rewind the clock
Hmm.
by 10 seconds and have said something differently, and everything was exactly the same, then what would have caused me to say B instead of A?
Right.
What would
If it's not a pure random chance, we have to suppose some mystical force that is
yeah,
you or your consciousness. Or I don't even know what we would call
yeah.
that. It just doesn't make sense.
It just doesn't logically fit into the equation here.
No.
Yeah.
We have provided a simpler model which can explain your behaviors, which is determinism or probabilism. Both of these are simpler to accept than some mystical force that has
Mhm,
no other existence, no other reason for its existence than our intuitive belief
mhm.
that it is there.
Yeah, and even if somebody were to posit the existence of a soul, and somehow the soul is doing actions, you'd still have to ask the question: what reason does that soul have for choosing one course of action over another?
Right.
So, like, what would cause something has to cause the soul to choose one action over another, and if there's nothing causing it, then
What is it?
by definition we call that random.
It has to be.
Yeah.
Surely. Like I totally agree. I think that determinism is not exclusive with the belief in spirituality or a soul. Obviously, if whenever like you said, whenever you choose anything, there's ultimately going to be some reason, no matter how minute, that makes you choose one thing or another.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. So, and the argument that we sort of just gave comes from Peter van Inwagen, and he's very famous in this field. And he essentially he gave the argument that we just gave that's known as hard incompatibilism. So it's even more than just hard
Oh yeah.
determinism. It's hard incompatibilism, meaning uh, no, it doesn't matter if determinism is true or indeterminism is true or false or whatever.
Mhm.
It simply cannot exist. It's something that doesn't exist.
Right.
And just as a quote from him, the argument that I just gave would be something like this. Interpreting causation as a deterministic relationship means that if A causes B, then A must always be followed by B. In this sense, war does not cause deaths, and nor does smoking cause cancer. As a result, many turn to a notion of probabilistic causation. Informally, A probabilistically causes B if A's occurrence increases the probability of B. This is sometimes interpreted to reflect the imperfect knowledge of a deterministic system, but other times interpreted to mean that the causal system under study has an inherently indeterministic nature.
Interesting. I love the little disclaimer at the end that maybe that means we just don't know all these,
Mhm.
or maybe it actually is raw probability.
Yeah. And in either case, there's no free will.
Right. I think we've successfully gassed out free will from every little nook it could be hiding.
Yeah.
There is no free will of the gaps. It is simpler to believe that it is either random or factors we don't understand yet.
Yeah, and it's so it's fascinating that I feel like there's literally an infinite amount of arguments against free will.
Yeah, I
Like
agree.
Gail Strawson, another famous philosopher on free will, has another really interesting argument, which essentially goes like this: uh, in order to have control of myself right now,
Hmm.
I must have had control of myself in the moment prior to me right now.
Interesting.
And in order to have control over that, I'd have to have control over myself previous to that,
Right.
and then
It's
previous to that, and then
infinite
previous to that,
chain.
and it creates an infinite regress. You just keep on going,
Right.
and at some point the line has to terminate. Do you ever control yourself along that line? And if you do control yourself, then what's causing you to control yourself in that way?
Right. It
Yeah.
needs to have some origin where you can actually control your actions because clearly there are things other than you that can control you.
Exactly.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
All right, yeah.
So
Let's talk
we
about libertarian free will.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we can also talk about libertarian free will a little bit. So libertarian free will, as I said earlier, is essentially the belief that is the ability to have done otherwise conception of free will. So it's the idea that if we rewinded the clock, you actually could have chosen a different set of actions.
Right.
And so there's a couple different models of libertarian free will, which honestly I don't know too well, but there's two main ones, which are the agent causal model and the event causal model. So um, the agent causal the agent causal model, yeah, the agent causal
Yes.
model would essentially say that there is like an agent, like a soul or something, and this soul is able to look at reasons and choose different sets of reasons. So let's say that let's just take an extreme example. Imagine you're in a situation where you're about to murder someone.
Okay.
Okay.
Easy to imagine.
Yeah. And let's say you have some great reasons to murder them. Like you
All
really
right.
hate them. You really hate them. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You really, really hate them. And then the other side, you have a reason against taking that action, which would be like, um, going to jail and all that,
Right.
or like moral reasons.
Mm-hmm.
You could have those on the other side of the scale. And the agent actually has the ability to choose one set of reasons over another. And so that would essentially be so if you were to able to rewind the clock, the agent would actually have the volition to choose one set of reasons over another
Right.
and weigh those individually. Um, Now, I think the determinist response would be that.
It would be, first of all, you have no evidence of this agent nor any reason they need to exist.
Mm-hmm.
We can simply explain these with the most compelling reasons or whatever reasons over trump other reasons for whatever reason. Strange interactions within your mind and environment
Yeah.
can explain these.
Yeah, and also something must. If we go back to determinism, right? Something must have caused the soul to choose one set of reasons over another.
Exactly.
There must be some external reason, some third party reason that's causing them to choose one over another.
Mm-hmm.
Either that or it's random. Literally, it's random.
Right.
Like if there's nothing causing it, this just seems conceptually like it has to be random.
On that note, can I talk about the goat that broke my brain all those
go
years ago?
ahead.
All right, so
This is very interesting.
this is a thought experiment he brought up to me. So if we have this goat you see, it's a perfectly symmetrical goat. Don't ask me about the anatomy of this goat, doesn't matter. And then it's in a perfectly symmetrical environment, left and right. And on its left, there's a hay bale, and on its right, there's a hay bale. And they're the exact same in every way, and the goat's very hungry. Which one will the goat choose? It's equidistant from both. It's exactly the same on both sides. The only way you can possibly conceive this goat not starving, or at least the only way I can, is it has to be random, or there has to be some imperfection. It can't be truly symmetrical. They can't be perfectly equal causes.
Mm-hmm. If there's nothing causing it, then it won't happen.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. The goat would simply just stand there and starve to death.
And just die.
uh, yeah. it seems like every action that we take really has to have a cause, or it has to be
Mhm.
random.
Surely, it has to
Maybe
be one
some
of those two.
quantum fluctuations in the goat brain cause it to choose
Surely,
one
surely.
over another.
Some particle will
Mhm.
happen to drift to the left or something.
Yeah.
But even that is still no free will.
Yeah. All right. So now that we've sort of covered the three main conceptions of free will, let's go to implications. You know,
Oh, yes.
uh, if we don't have free will, or if we, yeah, let's go with we if we don't have free will because I think that's what we both
Right.
believe.
If we do have free will, we're pretty much adapted for that as a society. That tends to be the intuitive response. I don't think there are a whole lot of implications there to go
Mm.
over.
Yeah, it seems like people often ask, you don't act like
No.
you don't have free will, right?
No.
But obviously you don't act like you don't have free will
No.
because you would have never evolved like that. If it really were the case that wait, let me say that again.
No, I get what you're saying. It's not possible to really function in a survival situation without
If you
assuming you have
just
control of your
yeah,
actions.
believing that you have control of your actions is extremely advantageous.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If, if you just sit down on the cave floor and you're like, well, what happens, happens, not all out of my
Yeah.
control.
What would it even look like to believe that you don't have free will? Like what would it look like to act like that? You know?
It's hard to grasp as anything more than a hypothetical
Mhm.
concept.
I mean, really, would you like people think that that you would just sit in your bed and just lie there and not get up to get breakfast or anything? You
Oh.
know, you just die in your bed because none of your you believe that none of your consequences have any action. But that's exactly what we're saying when there's
Hmm.
no free will. You don't have the free will to just sit on your bed and
Right.
die. Like there's always going to be reasons to push you up to go get breakfast. There's going to be some reason, and for some people there isn't, right? And for
Right.
some people there aren't those reasons.
That's very meta. The idea that the belief of free of not having free will
Mhm.
specifically is one of the factors that you have no control over that influences your behavior.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
very strange.
Hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, the implications for this as it applies to personal relationships are also obvious. You can't blame somebody existentially any more than you can blame their surrounding factors.
Mhm.
Under hard determinism, that
Mhm.
is.
I think one really interesting analogy is if we have like a murderer,
Hmm.
right? In human society,
Yeah,
we blame that person. We
right.
blame the murderer for their action, right? But if you think about it, do we blame like a bear for attacking someone?
No.
You know, you don't put moral responsibility, but why?
Well,
You
the
know,
difference is we can intuit that the murderer has free will and the bear clearly doesn't, because
exactly.
bear is a simple creature. We
Yeah.
can see every factor.
Uh-huh.
Just because we're complex doesn't really give us an exception.
Hmm. There's still factors that push the murderer into doing that, into committing that horrible crime.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in the same way that there's so many factors that cause the bear to
Hmm.
commit a horrible crime. But it even seems silly to call it a crime
Right.
because the bear is simply just acting upon intuition.
You can't hold the bear accountable,
Mhm.
which
Yeah,
for some reason we can't hold the person.
yeah.
So,
Although I think you could, I think if a compatibilist was here, they would
mhm,
say that, uh, the human actually does have faculties of reason,
mhm,
and their faculties of reason have failed
right.
in the case that they commit a murder or something like that. And for that reason, we can actually blame that person. We can say that
Mhm.
that nature is wrong. But people are not responsible for their natures.
No, even still, we can't punish this person any more than is helpful to society,
Hmm.
because there's no need for vengeance against this thing. You only need vengeance against the universe itself,
Hmm.
There's no point in punishing this person, just correcting.
Exactly.
So I suppose that's how we'd have to build a society around hard determinism if we were to accept it, or even compatibilism.
Yeah. Using punishments only insofar
Yeah,
as they have some benefit.
it's corrective.
Yeah.
There's no need to seek vengeance against the perpetrator of a
Hmm.
crime.
And like Weston was saying earlier, it's very utilitarian. It's
Yes.
uh, just as the utilitarian wouldn't necessarily believe in ideas of justice or vengeance. What really matters is reducing suffering.
Hmm.
That's really the goal at the end of the day.
This is a very collectivist set of beliefs, though,
Hmm.
what we've approached here. And I think the reason we don't already adapt this is we are a very individualist society, and humans tend towards individualism. It's very convenient for us. There's a natural conflict between this emotional appeal to individualism and obviously the actual logical appeal to collectivism.
Hmm.
If you ask me, that might be a hot take, I suppose.
Yeah.
But individualism might actually be the best. I mean, vengeance and individualism here, injustice, might actually be the most productive utilitarian approach, especially if the justice is, promoting enough joy and satisfaction and stability and unity in the society, that it is now worth the punishment to this one person.
Yeah.
So we get into very utilitarian problems there very quick. What would a compatibilist society look like?
So I think a compatibilist society would actually look just essentially how we have society right now,
All right.
like punishing people based on their nature, you know, because if somebody is acting freely with uh okay, if somebody is acting freely with oh my God, man.
If somebody's cause is from within them, if they are the source
Yes.
of their actions, then of course, under compatibilism, as a reminder,
Mhm.
we can consider them effectively accountable
Exactly.
because that is them on a very fundamental
Mhm.
level. Is when they are the source of it, that is their action.
Mhm. And I think that actually does work most of the time in society. However, it's probably not fair. Like
Hmm.
for example, Robert Sapolsky, he gives the example of how like as a society we trend towards going against free will. We sort
Right.
of take away free will from people. So if you go back 100 years, if a kid couldn't read properly, you just call them dumb, right? It's
Right.
their fault. It's their fault that they're bad at reading. Whereas now, maybe perhaps we'd call that dyslexia,
Interesting.
right?
I think this goes a little bit back to individualism versus collectivism, if
Mhm,
I can turn everything back to the terms I understand.
mhm.
As we progress as a society and become more logical and thinking, we are actually realizing more and more of these effects are out of our control.
Yeah.
We are tending more towards determinism historically.
And if this trend keeps on going, it seems like eventually free will as a concept might just not be a thing anymore.
Right.
Yeah, or at least in our justice system and the way that we see people.
But now I want to talk about how this impacts religion, this
Mhm.
trend,
Yeah.
because obviously this has some pretty big implications for any idea of accountability and sin or, whatever moral responsibility we can hold.
Yeah. So if pretty much all of the world's major religions believe in some sort of judgment, right?
Right.
You either are a good person and you go to heaven and live in eternal bliss for all of eternity,
Pretty great.
or you're a bad person and you burn in hell forever,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And I think if it really is the case that free will is not even logically possible, it's something it's like a triangle with 181 degrees.
Right. Just can't
It
exist.
just simply cannot exist. Then how could we be held responsible for our actions? It's so
Hmm.
existentially. On not even and it even goes back to sort of if God is actually the one causing everything, right?
Right.
If he's the one who is the ultimate cause of all things,
Hmm.
then he is the one who's causing all of our actions.
Absolutely. It's very difficult to understand how we could be held account our experience, our consciousness, although I
Mhm.
don't want to get into that debate yet. How we could experience being accountable for these punishments for something that seems so obviously out of our control. But the only way this works under compatibilism is if we actually are the sum of our environment. And that is actually what we are accountable for, and that is what will be punished.
Yeah, it's like watching a movie.
Hmm.
It's like watching a movie, like a POV movie, and
Yeah.
then at the end of the movie, the guy dies, and you get
Just
tortured in hell
actually,
forever. You know?
when you actually feel the pain of the
Yeah.
attack, it's totally out of your control, but clearly you're the one experiencing it, and you had no control over that. So how can that be fair? How can this punishments be fair?
Yeah. And actually, this in the Islamic tradition, this has been a position taken by many schools of thought that
Really?
that there actually is no free will, there is no control over the actions, and actually all actions, everything is under the power of God,
Right?
and somehow, and essentially, we acquire these actions. We're the medium by which actions are acquired,
That's
and by
yeah.
acquiring these actions, we become responsible for them. And I think that makes no sense.
Really? Uh,
Well, how can you? Something must have caused you to acquire those actions, right?
right.
Which would be God.
Right.
So,
I mean, it certainly it solves one problem in my mind, which is if God is almighty and all powerful, how could he not be responsible for not choosing to stop anything? It gets the problem. It solves the problem of evil.
it solves the problem of evil?
I think so.
Really?
If God is almighty and
Uh-huh,
could stop everything,
uh-huh.
why doesn't he? That's the problem of evil, right?
Yes.
But if God is just, acting through us and he's the cause of anything anyway, that's an easy way to reconcile these theories.
I actually think that makes the problem even worse.
Really?
Yeah, because you're saying that like one of the most common theodicies or like responses to the problem of evil would
Hmm.
be that free will. We have if we weren't able to do evil things, if every time I tried to murder someone,
Right.
God just stopped me, then I wouldn't be free.
Okay, I see what
Yeah,
you're saying.
right? But if there's no free will, that means that every time someone murders someone else, it's actually
It's
literally
just
God
God.
murdering them.
You're right. I
Yeah.
was now God's going to hold you responsible for it.
And now God is gonna exactly, and now God is gonna punish you for
You
that.
know what? I think you're right. I think I got that switched in my head somehow. The more you're right, God is just now dispensing suffering more directly.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely if you ask anyone, if you ask a religious person what their response to the problem of evil is, almost certainly it's going to be a free will response.
Right.
And if free will is not possible, then we have a problem.
Right. Yeah. God presents an interesting challenge to determinism because it's we've discussed this at length before, so let me know if I get off the rails
Mhm.
here. God, it is conceivable, could have free will. Let's talk about that possibility. And if God has free will, I mean, if God's all powerful, surely he must have everything, right?
Hmm.
Can God create a triangle with 181 degrees? Can God have something that doesn't exist otherwise? Or does God have free will and has he somehow imparted free will to us? That seems to me the only way you can immediately try and
Yeah,
combat determinism.
for sure. But then, what most theologians would see as the very pinnacle of natural theology
Mhm.
would be the contingency argument, right?
Yes.
Which we don't really have time to get into specifics, but if you're familiar with the contingency argument, you'll know that essentially the conclusion of the contingency argument would be that all contingent beings,
Hmm.
all beings that could be otherwise, are directly caused, directly brought into existence by the necessary being, and are
Right.
directly upheld in existence by the necessary being. That would be the conclusion of theologians. It seems like there is such a fundamental conflict between free will and theology there.
Yeah. Even the idea of a contingent being, something that could have been
Mhm.
otherwise, seems ridiculous compared to the determinism we've just thrown out, where
Mhm.
everything has a cause. It is only the one way it is,
Right.
with the exception of our random probability disclaimer.
Yeah. But you could also say a contingent being is something that could logically be
Right.
another way.
I may have misinterpreted that there.
Yeah, no, that's okay. We'll do another episode on the contingency argument
Oh,
for
I'm
sure.
sure.
Yeah. But it seems like if you accept the conclusion of the contingency argument, you can't necessarily believe in free will. And um, it, every single one of our decisions would be considered contingent because they could have logically been otherwise,
Right.
right? I could have raised my hand here, I could have raised my hand down here, whatever, right?
Hmm.
Those are contingent actions. So if you are to accept the conclusion of the contingency argument, the necessary being, which people would say is God,
Right.
is directly controlling that action, directly creating that action.
From the Big Bang, or the start of the universe, or
Exactly.
whatever.
Yeah.
It was always predetermined to be that way. It's very interesting.
Well, I think we covered pretty much everything we wanted to cover in
I
this
think so.
episode.
Yeah.
So yeah, should we do a little conclusion?
Let's do a little conclusion.
Yeah, so this is our first episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it, if anyone's listening. But we'll definitely do more. This is really for us, to
Yeah.
put our thoughts down and really just think about this more in a formal sense.
That said, I hope this is at least approachable. I know philosophy is probably the most gate-kept discipline of all time. Is what we've
Absolutely.
been saying.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can spread it out a little
Yeah.
bit and make these complex topics that really are so applicable, so important to think about as we develop,
Mhm.
a little more accessible to everyone.
Yeah, and please leave your thoughts and comments.
Yeah, we'd love feedback. We'd love ideas for future videos. I think contingency argument, consciousness,
Definitely gonna be next, I think.
utilitarianism,
Uh-huh.
all things we referenced, we're going to need future videos on.
Yeah. And remember, we don't really know what we're talking about, so
Not at
take
all.
everything we say with a grain of salt. And yeah,
Thank you for watching.
thank you for watching. Bye.